Hey everyone, are you ready to dive into something pretty wild? Today we're going deep into something that's all about you, your emotions.
Oh, yeah.
But not in the way you usually think about them, you know?
Yeah.
What if I told you that your feelings could actually be like quantifiable, measurable forces?
Hmm.
Kind of like invisible fields that are like influencing everything around you.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild thought, right?
It sounds wild.
It is a pretty radical concept.
Mm-hmm.
We're so used to thinking about emotions as these fleeting subjective experiences.
Right.
But what if they have like a deeper, more fundamental reality to them?
That's exactly what we're diving into today with what's called quantum emotional field theory, or QEF theory.
Hmm.
It's sometimes called that in this research paper that we're going to be exploring today. And it suggests that the same principles that are governing these tiny particles in quantum mechanics might actually apply to the way we experience and interact with our own emotions.
Yeah, and just like magnetic fields or gravitational fields, right? These emotional fields could have measurable properties, strengths, and even interact with each other in really fascinating ways.
Okay, so I'll admit, thinking of emotions as fields is a bit of a leap for me. I mean, I know my joy feels different from my sadness, but can we really measure them? Like we can measure gravity?
Well, that's one of the really intriguing propositions of this QEF theory.
Okay.
You know, it suggests that emotions might exist in what are called quantized states,
Okay.
meaning they exist in discrete, measurable units rather than on a smooth spectrum.
So instead of just saying like I'm feeling a little bit happy, QEF theory would be like my joy field is currently at a plus point 0.5.
Exactly, and those numerical values wouldn't just be arbitrary.
Okay.
The theory proposes a scale where, for example, intense joy might register as a plus 1.0, while deep self-loathing could be a minus 1.1.
Wow.
So this numerical representation could really help us understand the intensity and impact of different emotional states.
So it's like our emotions have a kind of power level that we could measure. I'm starting to see how this could get really interesting.
It does open up a lot of really intriguing possibilities, right?
Mm.
Imagine being able to like track your emotional weather patterns
Yeah.
throughout the day,
Yeah.
noticing how different situations or interactions influence your emotional field strengths.
Yeah, that's a cool thought. But what about like how our emotions affect other people? We all know how easily moods can spread.
Right.
Could QEF theory like explain that too?
Yeah, that's where the concept of emotional entanglement comes in.
Ooh, okay.
Just like particles can become linked in quantum mechanics and influence each other instantaneously, regardless of distance. QEF theory suggests that our emotional fields might be able to entangle as well.
So if I'm feeling super stressed, could my emotional state actually influence someone else's mood, even if they're like in a completely different room?
That's what the theory proposes.
Yeah.
Think about those times you've walked into a room and just instantly felt the tension,
Oh, yeah.
or how someone's bad mood can seemingly bring everyone down.
Yeah.
QEF theory suggests that those experiences might be more than just our imaginations picking up on these subtle cues. They could be a result of like genuine emotional entanglement.
Okay, now that is mind-blowing. But if our emotions are constantly entangling with others, wouldn't we just be overwhelmed by like a chaotic jumble of feelings all the time?
That's a great question. And this is where the idea of what's called the observer effect comes into play.
Okay.
Just like in quantum mechanics, the act of observing something can influence its state.
Right.
QEF theory suggests that our minds actually play an active role in shaping our own emotional landscape.
Okay.
Constantly choosing which emotional fields to kind of tune into, so to speak.
So it's not just about the emotions themselves, but about how we choose to engage with them. Does that mean we have more control than we realize?
Exactly. It's about becoming aware of our own emotional filters and how they might be amplifying certain emotions while diminishing others. We might have more agency over our emotional experiences than we think.
That's an empowering thought, but it also makes me wonder about like the sheer variety of emotions that we experience. It's not just happy or sad.
Right.
There are so many subtle variations and nuances. How does QEF theory account for that?
Well, remember how we talked about those quantized emotional states?
Mm-hmm.
QEF theory suggests that within each core emotional field, like joy or sadness, there are actually different flavors or subfields with their own unique characteristics and intensities.
So like different shades of the same color.
Precisely, for example, joy could have flavors like excitement, contentment, or peaceful satisfaction, each with its own distinct feeling and numerical value.
I like that peaceful satisfaction. I can totally feel the difference between that and, say, the joy of winning a competition. But does QEF theory say where all these different flavors come from?
That's where it gets even more fascinating. The theory suggests that these flavors can actually evolve and differentiate over time, branching out from the core emotions to create an ever-expanding emotional landscape.
Whoa, so our emotional palettes are constantly evolving, creating new shades and flavors as we experience more of the world. That's pretty incredible, but what happens when we actually act on an emotion? How does that change things?
With just like a wave function collapsing in quantum mechanics when it's measured. QE theory proposes that an emotional field collapses when we act on it,
Okay.
solidifying into an observable state.
Okay. I'm gonna need you to break that down for me. What does it mean for an emotional field to collapse?
Imagine you're feeling this buildup of anger, right? That anger exists as a field of energy within you.
Okay.
But the moment you yell at someone or punch a wall,
Yeah.
that anger field collapses into a specific action.
So the action is like the measurement that forces the emotion to take a concrete form.
Exactly. And once an emotion is collapsed in that way, it triggers what's called causal propagation.
Causal propagation. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that mean in the context of emotions?
It means that the expression of that emotion, your outburst of anger, for example, can actually influence the probabilities of future emotional states, both for you and potentially for those around you. It's like a chain reaction,
Oh, wow.
where one emotional event can kind of ripple outward and shape the course of future experiences.
So even though like the initial burst of anger might subside, it's still having a lasting impact on my emotional landscape. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples keep spreading outward.
Precisely. And those ripples can even interact with other people's emotional fields, creating these complex patterns of influence and entanglement.
Wow.
This leads us to another really intriguing concept in QEF theory, the idea of what are called collective emotional fields.
Collective emotional field. So like the overall emotional atmosphere of a group of people.
Exactly. Think about the energy of a crowd at a concert
Yeah.
or the somber mood at a funeral. QEF theory suggests that these aren't just subjective impressions,
Hmm.
but actual measurable phenomena.
So our individual emotional fields are contributing to this larger collective field, like a giant emotional soup.
That's a great analogy. At any given time, we're all experiencing this complex superposition of emotional fields, a blend of our own individual states, and the collective emotional atmosphere of the group we're in.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So we've got these individual emotional fields that can entangle, collapse, and propagate, and then they combine to create these larger collective fields that influence everyone within them. It's like we're all swimming in this invisible ocean of emotions.
It is a pretty mind-boggling concept, isn't it? And we're only just beginning to explore the implications.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've laid the foundation for understanding quantum emotional field theory, from the concept of emotions as quantifiable fields to the mind-blowing ideas of entanglement and collective emotional states.
Okay, I've had a moment to process, and I have to say this idea that our emotions are like these invisible fields constantly interacting and influencing everything around us is both fascinating and a little intimidating. It's definitely a shift in perspective. But remember, even familiar concepts like gravity were once revolutionary ideas. We couldn't see gravity, but we knew it existed because we could experience its effects. QEF theory is suggesting we might be experiencing the effects of emotional fields all the time without even realizing it.
That's a good point. I mean, we talk about feeling the vibe of a place or a person all the time. What if those vibes are actually these collective emotional fields at work?
That's exactly what QEF theory is trying to explore, and it's not just pulling this idea out of thin air. The research paper we're looking at connects this theory to some pretty compelling existing ideas about the brain and consciousness.
Oh, this is where I get really curious. I love those connections between different fields of knowledge. What kind of connections are we talking about?
Well, one connection is to what's called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH, or R, a theory developed by renowned physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff.
Penrose, wow. Isn't he the one who wrote that mind-bending book, The Emperor's New Mind? I remember trying to wrap my head around that one back in college.
That's him. And ORCH or R is a pretty mind-bending theory, too. It proposes that consciousness itself might arise from quantum processes happening within our neurons, specifically in these microscopic structures called microtubules.
So our brains are like little quantum computers. I've heard that analogy before, but it's always seemed kind of abstract. How does this relate to QEF theory?
It ties in beautifully because if consciousness has this quantum foundation, it lends credence to the idea that our emotions, which are so deeply intertwined with our conscious experience, would also operate on a quantum level.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but I have to be honest, the idea of emotions as these intangible fields is still a bit hard to grasp. It feels so different from how we usually think about them.
I understand it's a big shift in perspective,
Yeah.
but remember, we're already comfortable with the idea of invisible fields influencing us in other areas of life. We can't see magnetic fields, but we can observe their effects on a compass needle.
Right. Or how about radio waves? We can't see them, but they carry music and information through the air, allowing us to connect across vast distances.
Exactly. We accept these invisible forces as a part of reality in other areas of science. QEF theory is suggesting we might need to expand our understanding of reality to include the influence of emotional fields as well.
Okay, that makes me think about something earlier. You mentioned that QEF theory isn't just some isolated concept, it actually connects to other theories about how the brain works.
You had a great memory.
Yes. The paper we're discussing also mentions Karl Pribram's holonomic brain theory.
Holonomic brain theory. I'm not familiar with that one. What's the main idea?
It's a fascinating theory that suggests our brains might process information holographically, meaning that memories, thoughts, and even emotions aren't stored in specific locations, but rather distributed throughout the entire brain in these complex patterns of neural activity.
So it's not like there's a specific joy center or fear center in the brain, but rather these experiences emerge from the interactions of many different parts of the brain. Exactly, and this aligns really well with the idea of emotions as fields. Fields by the very nature are distributed phenomena.
Mm.
They're not localized to a single point, but rather spread out over an area.
Okay, that's starting to make more sense. So we have these emotional fields potentially rooted in the quantum processes of our brains, and they're not just fleeting experiences, but patterns of information distributed throughout our neural networks. That's pretty amazing.
It is, and speaking of those patterns, there's another intriguing element to QEF theory that we should discuss, the concept of emotional memory constants.
Emotional memory constants, those sound intense. What are they exactly?
They're essentially imprints of past emotional experiences that become embedded within our emotional fields.
So, like emotional scars, but not necessarily negative.
That's a good analogy. Think of them as records of how you've responded emotionally to various situations in the past. They could be positive, negative, or neutral.
And these emotional memory constants influence our current emotional responses. Does that mean we're constantly being shaped by our past experiences?
To a certain extent, yes. Let's say you had a wonderful childhood experience playing in a park every time you visit a park. Those positive emotional memory constants might get activated, making you more likely to feel happy and carefree.
So it's like our past emotions are literally woven into the fabric of our being, influencing how we experience the present moment.
Exactly, and this highlights the complex interconnectedness of our emotional lives, not just with each other, but also with our own personal histories.
Okay. I see how this could be both fascinating and a little unsettling if our past emotional experiences are always influencing us. Does that mean we're kind of trapped by them, destined to repeat the same emotional patterns over and over again?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of what makes QEF theory so empowering. Because while our past experiences do shape our emotional landscape, they don't completely determine it. Remember the observer effect.
Hmm.
We have the ability to choose which emotional fields we focus on, and we can cultivate more positive emotional states through conscious effort.
So it's not about being a prisoner of our past, but about understanding how it influences us so we can make more conscious choices in the present.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of self-regulation. QEF theory suggests that if we can understand how our emotional fields work, we can learn to manage them more effectively.
We talked about techniques like mindfulness and cognitive reframing earlier, but are there other ways we could potentially regulate these emotional fields?
The research paper mentions the idea of intentional field reinforcement, which essentially means consciously focusing our attention on positive emotional states and amplifying them.
So if I'm feeling anxious, I could try to cultivate feelings of gratitude or peace.
Exactly. By focusing on those positive emotions, you're essentially strengthening their corresponding fields, making them more likely to influence your overall emotional state.
And I'm guessing the reverse is true as well. If I keep replaying a negative experience in my mind, I'm actually reinforcing those negative emotional fields.
Precisely. That's why it's so important to be aware of our thought patterns and to make a conscious effort to cultivate more positive emotions.
Okay, so we've got mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and intentional field reinforcement. Are there any other tools in this QEF toolkit for emotional self-regulation?
Interestingly, the research suggests that even physical activities like exercise or spending time in nature can have a positive impact on our emotional fields.
That makes sense. I always feel calmer and more grounded after a long hike in the woods. It's like nature has a way of resetting my emotional balance.
Exactly. And from a QES perspective, those activities could be seen as ways of harmonizing our emotional fields with the natural rhythms of the world around us.
It's like we're tuning our inner emotional instruments to the symphony of nature. I love that analogy.
Me too. And it speaks to the interconnectedness of our emotional well-being with our physical health and our relationship with the natural world.
This is so fascinating. I feel like we're starting to see how QEF theory could have practical applications in our everyday lives. But the paper also mentions some even bigger implications, right? Like the possibility of emotional forecasting and the impact of collective emotional fields on society as a whole.
It did. And those are exactly the topics we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. Get ready for some truly mind-bending possibilities.
All right. I am so ready to go even deeper into this, emotional forecasting and the impact of these collective emotional fields on society. Those are some big ideas.
They really are, and they highlight just how much potential QEF theory has to not only change how we think about ourselves, but how we understand the world around us. You know,
So let's start with emotional forecasting. Is it really possible to predict someone's future emotional states based on their past experiences? I mean, it sounds a little like science fiction to me.
it kind of does, doesn't it? But think about how much our past shapes our present. You know, our
Yeah.
previous experiences, the emotional memories that we carry with us, they all influence how we perceive the world and how we react to different situations.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like if someone has a history of anxiety, it makes sense that they might be more likely to feel anxious in situations that remind them of, past stressful experiences.
Exactly. And QEF theory suggests that if we could accurately map an individual's emotional field history, all those past experiences and emotional memory constants that we talked about, we might be able to predict their future emotional responses with a certain degree of probability.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it could be possible, at least theoretically.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that mean that we're all just slaves to our past with no real freedom to choose how we feel?
That's a really valid concern, and it's an area where ethical considerations would be absolutely paramount. But remember, QEF theory also emphasizes the power of the observer. We have the ability to choose which emotional fields we tune into, and we can learn to cultivate more positive states through conscious effort.
So it's not about being trapped by our past, but about using that understanding to make more informed choices in the present.
Precisely, emotional forecasting wouldn't be about, like, dictating someone's emotional future,
Yeah.
but about providing them with insights that empower them to make more conscious choices.
I can see how that kind of knowledge could be incredibly helpful in therapy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine a therapist being able to identify recurring negative emotional patterns in a client and then working with them to develop strategies for interrupting those patterns before they escalate.
It's like having an early warning system for emotional distress.
Exactly. Or imagine being able to identify emotional triggers that might be contributing to unhealthy behaviors.
That would be huge for helping people overcome addiction.
It really could, and the potential applications go so far beyond just individual therapy. Think about conflict resolution or even international diplomacy.
Wow, now you're really blowing my mind. How could QEF theory help us resolve conflicts on a global scale?
Well, if we could understand the collective emotional dynamics that are driving these conflicts, we might be able to develop much more effective strategies for de-escalation and reconciliation.
So instead of just focusing on the political or economic factors, we'd also be addressing the underlying emotional currents that are often driving those conflicts in the first place.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that emotions aren't just personal experiences. They're powerful forces that shape our individual and our collective realities.
That's a really powerful thought, and it makes me think about the idea of collective emotional fields that we touched on earlier. You mentioned that they could have a significant impact on society as a whole. Can you elaborate on that?
Of course, remember how we talked about those individual emotional fields combining to create these larger collective fields? Well, imagine that on a societal scale, the collective emotional state of a community, a city, even a nation can influence everything from economic trends to political movements to social change.
So are you saying that the overall mood of a society can actually shape its destiny?
In a way, yes. Think about how fear can lead to isolationism or how hope can inspire social movements. QEF theory suggests that these aren't just metaphors, but actual energetic forces at work.
Okay, that is a little mind-boggling, but also incredibly fascinating. It's like we're all connected by these invisible threads of emotion, and those connections are constantly shaping the world around us.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and it highlights the importance of cultivating positive emotional states, not just for our own well-being, but for the well-being of society as a whole.
So if we want to create a more just compassionate and peaceful world, we need to start by paying attention to our own emotional landscapes and the collective emotional atmosphere we're contributing to.
Exactly, and this brings us back to the importance of self-regulation. The tools we've discussed, mindfulness, cognitive reframing, intentional field reinforcement,
Yeah.
they're not just for individual growth, they're also essential for creating a more harmonious and thriving world.
This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. I feel like we've explored so many fascinating ideas from the quantum nature of consciousness to the possibility of emotional forecasting to the profound impact of these collective emotional fields.
It has been quite a journey, hasn't it? And it's a journey that's only just beginning. QEF theory is still a young field with so much more to explore and understand.
But even in its early stages, it's clear that QEF theory has the potential to completely revolutionize how we think about emotions about ourselves and about the world around us. It's like a whole new frontier of human understanding has opened up.
It has, and I encourage all of you listening to continue exploring this
Mhm.
frontier. Pay attention to your own emotional experiences. Do some research on QEF theory and ask yourself, how might this new understanding change the way you live, the way you interact with others, and the way you contribute to the world?
That's a great challenge to leave us with. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible deep dive into this quantum realm of human emotions.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, the possibilities are truly limitless when we start to view the world through the lens of the heart and perhaps the lens of quantum mechanics as well.